Hello, hello. It's Requel back in the van with Tyler. And today I'm back talking uh, The Conjuring. And I just kind of meditated. I gave my reaction right out of the theater for The Conjuring 4. And I've just kind of meditated on it a little bit. And I keep thinking about, like I talked about the two Chavez films, or Chavez, um, and the two Juan films. And I think the sensibilities of the directors is Chavez has used a lot of things that you see more as horror tropes and homage to horror movies, where I feel like James Wan had a pacing to his films and the stories, the way they were crafted. And I haven't dug into the screenwriters of who screenwrote what film, but the first film really focused on faith. The Warrens did what they did because of their faith. And I don't know James Wan's personal faith or whatever, but I feel like everything that I've read and seen with that, um, their faith is what kind of pushed them. And I think that is it's the faith and the power of good and God that overcomes evil in these movies. They investigate and they have to. It's always funny because in the first one they made such a big deal of Ed, uh, doing the exorcism because the preacher wasn't there, you know, and then you have similar things echoed in each film. Um, and I still say the third film goes too exaggerated, too fictionalized, um, and I feel like the last two films lost that. They fell more into tropes, and I haven't seen The Nun 2 since theaters, and that one was also directed by Michael Chavez. So he's directed, if you look at it, he's directed the majority of the Conjuring universe films, with Juan doing two, him doing technically four if you add La Llorona, and I don't even remember who directed Annabelle Comes Home, uh, which I feel like that one gets forgotten a lot. But I I really just the more I think about the last Conjuring film, I really feel like it's too fantasized, and some of the ways that things are done over the top with the mirror spinning. And then when you learn more about the Schmerl family and how they really did experience some horrible atrocities, I think the choice is wrong the way they structured the film. I think you really need to dive into the film, or into the family, and I think that's why the first movie works so well. Is you get to know this family and you like this family, and you're worried about the family. And in here, even the second film does too. And I think that's in Juan's sensibilities as a director, and that's what's missing. You know, you have to step outside the idea that the real Warrens were not these great people, the couple that is and anytime you deal with any kind of spiritual or supernatural things, some people say the Warrens were con artists. I don't know. Okay. I can't speak to them. Were they great people? Probably not. There's been things said about them, so I don't know. Okay. We have the fictionalized version, and I think that's where the problem comes, is we spend so much time with the fiction. We are so caught up and hung up on the fictionalized versions instead of less is more, right? So if we spend less time with the Warrens, it helps keep that idea of the truth of who these people are. And by incorporating too much of their personal lives, like with Judy and everything like that, and the way that Judy's birth, it gets too fantastical. But if you're looking at it just as a story, and then it works, and I feel like that's where we were with the Chavez films, is we're just looking at this as a story. Part of my issue with the climax of The Conjuring 4 is how exactly do they stop the mirror? They almost make Judy into thinking that she's 11 here, you know, using her clairvoyant psychic ability. But, their clairvoyancy is to sense these things, to see these things. And it really is their faith and their power and their belief in God that gives them the ability to abolish these things and deal with that. And, you know, Ed shoves the Bible, the book, into the mirror, right? And so it really just feels like you're falling into similar tropes that we've seen in other films like The Exorcist or anything that deals with like the church versus evil, right? And I think that's what is the diminishing returns in The Conjuring 3 and 4 is because you like these characters, but yeah. So I still think that if this movie's done as well as it has, that they could pull off and do a Nun 3 and have the third act have Ed and Lorraine show up uh, to show how they, you know, uh, exercise or were part of the exorcism or whatever for uh, Valak and really set up that opening scene in The Conjuring where they're talking about that's why they stopped because she had her vision, really tie it all together because that's still a loose thread out there, okay? And I think you only get one more solid nun movie because you can only stretch things so long with the technically, oh, the good guys won. No, they didn't because we know what's going to happen. And the nun with the relics and stuff, it gets too far fetched. Um, but I digress. Here I usually pitch ideas, right? And we know that they're doing a Conjuring TV series. So this is a multi-layered pitch discussion because what I'm thinking about, all right, is the TV series. You got to start with maybe it works kind of like a journal. Maybe you get some voiceover from Patrick Wilson or Vera Farmiga back and forth, right? And they go back, and it's kind of like it's the process of them writing the book and they're telling their stories. So we can jump around through time. Okay, maybe we talk a little bit, we go back and how we saw a little bit how they met, in Conjuring 3, right? Talk about how they met and their first time of, case, their first time investigating anything, and it wasn't anything, or it was, because we know that there's some times they got called out, and that was something that I liked in the first Conjuring where they're with the couple and he's talking about the floorboards and everything, and it wasn't a ghost. It wasn't anything. It wasn't any kind of demonic activity. It was something simple, just people's imagination. Um, and I think that is what is needed is this idea of not everything is the biggest case. And I really I go back to Supernatural did such a great job of how they did their stories and pacing and things that I think if you did do a Conjuring series, it kind of would be interesting to make them these secondary type characters where you really do like a cold opening and you set up the family or the people and then they go in to investigate. But you couldn't, I don't think doing a series, if you look at it, okay, each Conjuring movie is over 2 hours. And for a horror film, that's That's pretty long. So if you look at the way TV's done, especially if you're going to do an HBO Max series, each season would probably be a case. It'd be like an extended film, probably. You would need some things along the way. You got to have, you know, story beats, and then you would have to dive into these people more. But what's really left there to mine, if you've already sold us on four films, like The Biggest Case, one they couldn't share till now, The Case That Destroyed the Family, that made them give it up. And if you're not going to have Patrick and uh, Vera, unless you got them in very small parts, like I said, or voiceovers, much like Dexter Original Sin, which Dexter Original Sin, great series, very horrible that they canceled it. That was a very well done show. Um, I'm just kind of like, what do you tell? What is the Conjuring TV series? What does that look like? Um, unless it's a collection of where you're getting into stories by other people, like the priest who contacted Father Gordon and everything, uh, that for the La Llorona, and you get into like other characters than just the Warrens. Um, Still think the Conjuring universe has one good movie left, which is being, like I said, My Nun 3 pitch. Um, because you really made Valak the kind of Thanos level villain of the entire series. Um, but I really think that Chavez just really delivered some generic, cheap thrill type to a series that really had a way of haunting you. Um, with the less is more. I mean, the first film being the isolated farmhouse, smart. Uh, I just really learning about the Squirrels, what they endured. I think you could have had a more heart pounding, horrible, tragic, really scary horror film about people who are being harassed by malevolent forces, and you kind of watered down the family to being just these background people for Judy. And I think that Judy was always kind of there, but it just feels kind of cheesy, like in some ways, and it's sad. Um, I like the idea. Now let's step aside of a good couple that helps people. They do lectures and they do like their museum, and like it would have been interesting if we showed them set up the museum or whoever decided to do the museum. Like that idea, like whose idea was it to have people pay to see these items? Like, and that could have been something that was at the end of this movie, is them like as retirement showing off the items, you know? Because how do they get their money? You know, I don't know, I cannot remember if in the real life they ever charge people for services or whatever. Like, I don't know if the Catholic Church ever pays them when they send them out on cases to investigate. Um, so they just kind of they just do this as a side, thing, along with whatever else they really do, which makes them seem even more like good people. But let's talk about the other side of a story that could be told. And I think you can kind of get one good movie out of this, maybe. What I call Ted and Lauren Walters. Ted and Lauren Walters is based on the idea of the opposite of Ed and Lorraine, fictionalized version. This is your couple that comes in that preys upon the family, that are the con artists, that are, convincing people that they're really haunted or that there's these demonic spirits, and they're going in there and blessing this. And the story is these people, and we dramatize some of the real life where, you read stories about the Warrens showing up at like the Smurls. They didn't really find a way to help them and they left. Like they investigated and left. So you could see like the side of where these people show up, pretend to help people or show up and, you know, oh, we helped you, and then the thing comes back or whatever. And they try to play like, oh yeah, um, well, we're not con artists, but we as the audience really see that and know that they are. And then, of course, what happens is they fall into a real case and run into actually being in over their head to where now they have to try to actually do what they say that they do. And what kind of story is that? What does that look like? Is that something that would be interesting? Because, like I said before, like I'm a huge fan of Supernatural and just the way that story, people investigating. I like the idea of it being now a like middle-aged couple, um, investigating and doing these things. But you have to have the faith. You have to have the uh, like the woman like really seeing what she suffers with having these abilities and like certain shots of like going places or seeing and just seeing things that she naturally wouldn't want to see, feeling energies because they're not really acknowledging ghosts. Okay, that's a big thing is that they're not talking about there's no such thing as ghosts. Like they don't talk about it. Everything that they're talking about is like demonic entities and that the only real supernatural evil is demonically powered. So that's something to think about too, and where that comes from. And I've talked about before about, both the Nun 1 and Annabelle 2 both have stories inside those films that could have been films themselves. The Nun about how the person tricked them in building that to actually raise a demon. Um, and, the mirror demon thing in the Conjuring 4 just feels generic. Um, and then, of course, the Mullins whole story in Annabelle Creation could have been its own movie. Um, but I like The Conjuring has such an interesting place because it is a blend of reality and fiction. But the more you do, the more fictionalized it gets, and that's the problem with like based on these people. And I think there's a film that can be made about more about the real people, to where you're not sure if you really like them or not. I don't know. It's up to the audience, kind of thing. Like, was it haunted? Was it not haunted? Kind of story. But that's my conversation for today. Thoughts in the comments. So, caveat here. The Crooked Man, I always just took as was something stupid that the kids kind of nursery rhymed about. It was like a little story. It wasn't a real person or ghost, but um, the demonic entity took the image of the Crooked Man just to scare the kid because it was already something creepy. And I never wanted a Crooked Man movie. Like, I just feel like that was bizarre. That wasn't really anything. It was just something that was there as one of those kid things to give something creepy to do. And that's one of those, like, that's one of James Wan's, I think, that with, like, the CG Crooked Man, it would have been better to have someone, in real costume. But that's why I think the first movie is just really done, very minimalistic and well done.